All right, recording is on. Welcome to the Network Plumbing Working Group meeting for Thursday, May 10th, 2018. And the first item on the agenda is the updated specification, format, and organization. I'm not sure if people have been tracking what I've been trying to do with this document for the past day or so. But I went through and I kind of created an outline for the document. And let's see, let me share my screen really quick just to show you kind of what I was doing with that. So hopefully you can see my screen. I took the document and I attempted to kind of distill it down into what the key points were from each section. And then I started reorganizing the document and moving things around and tightening up the wording for that. So if I can actually figure out how to stop sharing my screen, there we go. So hopefully that gives you kind of an idea of what I was trying to do with this. And I've been working off of that outline to kind of reorganize the document. And I am most of the way through. The only things left are some specification around the cluster-wide default network, as well as what the runtime, some considerations for the runtime stuff. I've kept the original text below because I'm pulling mostly from that. But at the end of this, I intend to delete most of that text. I will go through the comments on that old text and try to resolve them or at least comment on them. So other than that, obviously people probably have not been able to read fully through this, which is fine. What I'm looking for is, does this look like the right direction to go? Does this seem more readable and more organized? And are there any other suggestions for format of this new format for the specification that anybody has? So I'll just open it up to the floor for comments.
Okay, I'm afraid I've only just started looking at it. It looks good so far. There's one thing we talked about that I haven't noticed yet, which is a distinction between stuff we're really trying to specify and stuff that's more of a tactical or roadmap issue. So I think we intend to support the idea that this specification is something that can be dynamically updated, and that those updates dynamically tracked. But right now there's language in here about it being done with a shim plugin, which obviously precludes dynamic tracking. So I think the idea is that's expected as the first step on the roadmap of exploring this, but is not something we really want to specify.
All right, fair enough. Okay, yeah, I can take that out. No,
I'm not saying take it out. I'm just saying make a distinction, mark it somehow as, move it to a separate section somehow. But probably that might be the best. Is put in a separate section to say, here's spec, and then here's our expectation about our roadmap. Say we start experimenting with a shim plugin, but we want to be able to go further to support dynamic updates.
Okay, yeah, and what I was thinking of doing there was, I still would remove the shim language from the section 2.1, the definition of the meta plugin, and just keep that generic, but then perhaps add a section below that does what you're suggesting, which is, here's what we think stage 1 of this should be, here's what we think stage 2 could be. Does that sound reasonable?
I think you said remove the meta plugin from section 2.1?
No, in section 2.1, it currently reads the shim CNI plugin that implements the specification. That's like the definition of meta plugin. I would remove the language that talks about the shim CNI plugin and just keep it fairly generic, saying something like the thing or the program or the service that implements the specification.
So yeah, let's just talk about the implementation.
Yes. Yep.
Right. So we can, I think, move section 2.1. That becomes this later roadmap thought.
Sure.
So in the spec, we don't talk about a meta plugin. We just talk about the implementation.
Okay. That's fair enough. Let me make a note in the agenda for that. All right. So noted. Any other comments? Does this look like a good direction to go with cleaning up the language and the format of the specification? I was attempting to add concrete labels and sections to it so that implementations could refer to those sections, or that we could be more precise in referring to those sections when we do that in the future. All right, Mike agrees. Yay. All right, as always, feel free to make more comments on it. There have been quite a few over the last couple of meetings. That's great. Let's keep going. Hopefully, once we have, once the spec is completed, or at least once I've completed the rewrite, and once we've had a couple more comments and some time to look over it, I'd say maybe until the next meeting. The next meeting here, we should close out as many of the remaining issues as we can and try to progress towards a V1 release of this specification. So I don't want it to drag out forever, and I don't think anybody else does either. With that, I guess we'll move on to the next agenda item, which was update on multiple attachments in CNI. In the CNI maintainer meeting yesterday, we discussed multiple attachments again and decided that Mike's proposal for updating the uniqueness tuple to include the interface name was acceptable. So for the, hopefully for version 0.4 of the CNI specification, language will be added to the specification to add the interface name to that uniqueness tuple. And the CNI reference plugins, which basically means host local, will be updated to support that as well. So we can depend on that in our specification here for providing multiple attachments. That still means that the actual CNI plugins themselves, like you know, if you develop a plugin, Calico, OpenShift, whatever, those plugins would need to be updated to consider the interface name as part of their uniqueness for an attachment if they want to advertise conformance to the CNI 040 specification. But we felt like most plugins, that would not be a huge hill to climb and should be fairly minimal.
Great. I'm glad to hear that.
Things do happen.
Yes, yes. So the thing that was blocking me actually working on the standard plugins was the fact that they were stale to begin with. Do you recall if there's any progress on that?
What do you mean by stale to begin with? Are you referencing the lack of a revender?
Right.
Into the plugins? Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. So I did a patch or a PR for CNI to fix up all the test cases that you had pointed out. That got merged yesterday as well.
Great.
So basically, all we need now is to actually do the revender, which shouldn't be that hard. If you want to do a PR for that, that's fine. Otherwise, we'll do another PR for that, hopefully in the next week or so. By we, I mean one of the CNI maintainers will.
I'll let you do that. Yeah, I've got so many emergencies dumping on my head.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, and I mean, I did a local revender and verified that all the test cases pass with that revender in. So that should be pretty much set to go.
Great. Glad to hear it.
So I think with respect to multiple attachments and our specification, we probably need to tighten up some of the language around how the implementation deals with the multiple attachments. I know Doug and Tomo, or one of you had added a section for that, and I think I cleaned up a little bit of that, but we probably need to take another look at that with respect to CNI and the changes there. We also do not anymore need to have wording around the workaround that Suresh was talking about a couple months ago for this, so we can probably remove that from the old document as well. So I think that is it for that agenda item. The last thing I had was when cleaning up the spec, I was wondering if it was useful that attachments that don't return a CNI result should still be represented in the status map for the annotation, the status annotation. And the issue there is that CNI does not require that plugins return a useful result. They can either return an error or they can return an empty result. It does not mandate that you return an IP address or that you return any of the other details. So the question there is, given that, which I think is sort of reasonable, should a network that does not return a result be represented in the status map? I thought it should, and it probably should just get an entry with its name, and that's it. It doesn't need to populate the IP address, MAC address, or anything like that. But I felt like it was useful to have the existence of that attachment be represented, if not the direct details.
Right. I would go further and say if it returned an error, let's report the error.
Okay. That's interesting. I will add that to the agenda as a topic. Does anybody else have feelings on that? Although, so if it reports an error though, Mike, I believe we do fail the pod network attachment. So, I mean, I guess that could be posted to the pod, even though the pod wasn't running. And there's also the question of if the pod fails continuously, do we just put the most?
Wait a minute, but we're talking about the multi-network stuff now, right?
Yes.
So
yep.
If one of them fails, the others don't. I would kind of expect that. I mean, I don't remember. Did we discuss this? I would have expected that, the ones that succeed, and the ones that failed have their failure recorded, and that's that.
Maybe we didn't discuss that, but I guess I would have the opposite expectation that if one of the networks that is specified is not able to be attached, if the pod is not able to be attached to one of the specified networks, that the pod would fail to start, given that the user had requested attachment. I seem to recall maybe thinking at one point a couple months ago that you could annotate the network selection annotation. I mean, that sounds odd, but that we could modify the network selection annotation to include some kind of special symbol or something else like that to say, hey, this is an optional network. It would be great. But I think I discarded that idea because I wanted to try to keep this specification simple and just try to get a V1 pass.
Well, again, I'm also keeping in mind the dynamic situation, right?
Right.
If you've got a running pod and try to add a new attachment that fails, I would not want that to destroy the pod.
Yeah, I would agree in the dynamic situation. So that's an interesting disconnect between pod startup and dynamic.
Well, it's a matter of definition. I mean, we could have a definition that says, the ones that work you get, and the ones that don't you don't. Always.
Yeah, I'd hope that there would be some way of marking certain networks as required, such that if the pod did actually depend on a particular network, that it would fail if it wasn't able to do that.
Yeah, I think it should be configurable for certain networks, right? Because it could be essential that I connect to certain networks.
Yeah, I mean, I sympathize. I mean, I rarely expect users to ask for attachments when they're not essential.
Well, there could be some that's not essential, right? Like for example, maybe I have a logging network that's not fatal in some way, maybe.
I don't know. Maybe I don't know. I guess I would be okay with having them all required, and even in the dynamic situation, a failed attachment destroys the pod. It seems a bit rude, but they seem kind of necessary. I mean, if your logging doesn't work, your pod is pretty broken.
Sure. I mean, that's true too. One thing is, I wonder. So let's say if we don't fail the pod, how would you find out that the pod has a bad state? Like, do you have to have a thing that parses annotations, result annotations, to say something failed?
That's what I would think. I mean, the failure would go in the annotation. Right? We could also post an event.
Okay. But when you issue things like kubectl commands, you wouldn't see that status, right? You would see all the pods as running properly.
Right. That's it's in some sense, as long as we are not in the modifying the kube models, our only choices are to be a invisible addition or fail the pod.
Yeah, so is that reasonable?
Well, actually, it's true. There are pod conditions, right? We could have a pod condition that reflects whether there is success or failure here. But I think pod listings don't normally reflect pod conditions. Or do they? I don't remember.
I don't remember either. Would anybody object if we added this to what did I call that section? The open questions section?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. Added a section about dynamic attachment failures and errors to the dynamic attachment updates part of the open questions section at the bottom of the document. I had planned to keep that section in the document even after the reformat, since I think it's very valuable history. All right, other than that, there wasn't any additional agenda. I will continue to finish out the document, so if people can take a look and read through it again. I know Doug is on PTO. He had promised last time to help with review of the document, and I assume once he gets back from PTO, he will do that. Let's see here. Feng, did you want to talk about the demo? Was there any status update you wanted to give for the Multis demo next week?
I think this is more of just an announcement. We are going to do the demo itself, presentation plus a live demo in the next sig-network meeting. That's next Thursday. So make sure you attend. I think it will be an interesting demo.
Okay, and just for the record, what exactly is getting demoed?
So this will be a demo of the actual spec itself. We're going to talk about the spec. We are going to talk about a reference implementation that's done in Multis that has part of the spec. It's everything we specify as far as what networks do we want to plug in for the pods, but not the result object, for example. So we will have a feature list as defined in, we call phase 1. And potentially we can have another further demo depending on the feedback.
Okay, thanks. All right. Any other issues to discuss? Anybody else want to bring anything else up?
So there was this question, I think it's also in the document from Lamante in Nokia, I think. And the question is, do we see any of this annotation that we are specifying to eventually make into Kube API proper at some point?
Yeah, so I would hope that this document is at least a basis for whatever upstreaming ends up happening. Or, I mean, as a basis, I mean, great, if the stuff that we're specifying here finds its way substantially unchanged into Kube, that's fine. But if not, that at least the lessons that we've learned from the various POCs that we've been doing and from developing the specification and the use cases that we've been looking at for this specification, those would hugely inform whatever solution actually does end up being upstreamed. I think the goal that at least I had with this was to work all of this out, get something out there that worked, get a reference implementation that people can actually use in production. And once we do that, I think that would help figure out exactly what we need to do for upstreaming. The upstreaming work kind of got put on hold, I guess, while we were doing this because some of it was a little contentious and there were a lot of things around API that were undecided and bike shedding. And so
there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
This opens a lot of questions. It does not answer them, but this is just the first step.
Yep. But it allowed us to figure out what those questions even were in this forum and to sort of figure out how to solve them without kind of bogging down sig-network itself with all of those questions.
Right. I think the question was more of a directional, in terms of, are we ever, considering even, moving something into proper Kube API, or is this more of a, Istio sort of approach where it's forever going to be sidecar top of, Kubernetes?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I think to some degree that depends on upstream and how upstream comes around or does not come around to multiple network use cases. I think I was hoping that it would eventually end up being a large component of whatever got done upstream, but it may just end up informing the upstream discussion and helping us come to a consensus that may or may not look like this specification. So that's kind of a vague answer to the question, but
yeah.
Right. I think the short answer is that that's yet to be determined.
Yeah.
Right. We're trying to do something that we think could go upstream, as provided all the other issues get settled satisfactorily. But we don't want to. We just don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, and I think the discussion around device plugin and resource management to some degree will also shape that, any upstream discussion, because we know that at some point in the future we're going to need to think about scheduling and resource management. And so that's going to be probably a critical component of whatever gets done upstream. And given that we haven't and we aren't addressing that in this proposal, whatever form upstreaming does take will obviously be somewhat different from what we've got here. But I think, again, the goal of this specification is just to prove out a lot of the issues that weren't necessarily related to all of the upstream discussion that had blocked us for a while on this stuff. And I mean, at least it's given me a much better understanding of all the issues around multi-network and, the use cases as well.
Yep, excellent. So just regarding that topic, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the device plugin as well. So there is an effort to do a SRV device plugin demo, POC demo, that involves introducing this idea of having device plugin as part of network story, because I think it does naturally make sense to use that for SRV use cases, and I think that introduces some interesting possibility, I think, going forward, for everything else as well, right? Because we have a daemon set that runs all the time, so that opens up the possibility of things that's dynamic, for example. Now I don't know that device plugin itself is the answer. But at least that's the direction, I think, where it's going.
Yeah, I think most of the more complicated network plugins will end up having that kind of daemon model, where there is just a really thin shim that sends the information to the daemon. But when we end up doing a gRPC style interface for CNI, which I think is more or less agreed that it could be done. It just needs somebody to actually do the work, then that will make it much easier to do that. And we'll be able to cut out the CNI binary shim.
Right.
All right. Were there any other thoughts? Did anybody on this call attend KubeCon in Copenhagen? Oh, okay, Mike. Do you want to give a trip report or anything like that?
Oh, well, okay.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah. Well, I did write up a trip report. I have to do it soon, otherwise I'll start to forget. So I guess I'll say the topics that I noticed, just in general as KubeCon, were the hottest themes. I would say were there's a lot of emphasis on moving up the stack. Serverless got a lot of attention. Machine learning did. Security got a lot of attention. GitOps got some love. Kube-based APIs got some love. And some older topics continue to get love. Service meshes, VM still got some attention. FD.io, they're still there. Let's see. So the point about moving up the stack is that the claim is that Kubernetes is really becoming the dominant way to manage containers. It really seems to be starting to win over all the competitors. And the good news there is that when you have wide agreement on something, then that makes it easier, provides a bigger community for work farther up the stack. So it really fosters growth farther up the stack. And there was a lot of stuff talk along that theme. For example, there was enthusing about Kubeflow, which is doing it's a compendium of libraries for machine learning based on standard Kubernetes interfaces. There was some interesting enthusiasm about serverless. There was a guy who was pointing out that every innovation in the compute abstraction led to innovations higher up the stack. So as we move from physical machines to virtual machines, from virtual machines to containers, and from containers, well, that's the historical part. Each one of those moves engendered changes higher up the stack. So, for example, he was saying, well, DevOps is the practice that's appropriate for containers. So serverless, being the next iteration, next turn of the crank on compute abstraction, will engender, again, evolution or innovation at the higher levels of the stack. And thus, DevOps, which we all think of as the great new thing, is going to become the new legacy. And something else is going to come up out of serverless. Now, I myself think there's a little bit missing from the serverless story. It doesn't have an end-to-end reliability the way the Kube control plane does. But maybe someone will figure out how to add that and make it actually good. So that's to be seen. Let's see. What else do I want to say? There was a lot of love or interest on security. So the whole thing started. The first keynote was the head of CNCF, executive director, saying, "Hey guys, don't forget we're at the top of a huge pyramid of stuff, and there are vulnerabilities in all of it." Also, he pointed out that Kubernetes itself is now bigger than the Linux kernel. I find that a little bit surprising, but anyway. So yeah, and then there was another woman, Liz Rice, who got up and just reminded us that we're still typically running inside our containers as root, and that's actually bad, and showed some ways in which it's bad. And we can do better, but we typically don't. So there was some discussions of building APIs for building container images on Kubernetes, some of which has various levels of concern for security. And there was interest in coming up with a standard Kube API for describing how to build a container image. There are already several such, and there was some desire to see what we can do about, rather than a bunch of independent things getting together on something common. In a similar vein, just isolation, right? So the containers, they're built on the Linux namespaces, and several people, again, have independent bits of work for doing better isolation. And again, there was some desire to say, okay, let's see if we can get together now and agree on some common API. Of course, you don't always want better isolation, right? Like when you want host networking, you often want also to be more intimate with the host. But when you do want good isolation, the thinking was, well, there are a lot of different techniques out there now. We're probably not going to converge on one. So we need an API. We should probably have a common API to which you can say, do you want isolation? And if so, which kind? Again, that's just kind of a thought. People are just trying to get together on that. And again, in another similar way about APIs, again, a kube-oriented API, kube-based API, is for describing clusters. There are several systems out there now that will create a cluster based on, again, a kube resource that describes what the cluster should look like. And again, the question is arising, should we get together and have a common way of defining a cluster? Interestingly, they're running into a problem that I see us heading into, which is there's a resource called cluster in the cluster federation, and then there are other resources called cluster coming from these other works that define cluster. You don't really want to have two different kinds of resource that use the same kind, short name for the kind. So that's one of the reasons that I think we should not use the name network for our network attachment formula.
Yeah, that is a good point, and we probably would run into problems with that in the future.
Yeah. Was someone else trying to bring up something else here? Okay. I'll just cap off with one other thought.
I think Dinesh had something to say.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dinesh. My first time here. I was in KubeCon, and that is what motivated me to join today. I was also going to bring out this lot of interest just shown about visibility, Prometheus, and other visibility tools. I saw some nice solutions out there, and that caught my interest too.
Yeah, and that's actually a good point. Our specification doesn't say anything about metrics and logging, but I've found that to be really helpful in most of the pieces of Kube that I work on. And so any implementation of this specification should probably think hard about what kind of metrics and logging it wants to do, because there's a lot of opportunity in this spec for it.
Is that really an issue for this spec, or is it properly delegated to the CNI plugins?
It's delegated to CNI plugins at this point. I don't think we should address it. I'm just saying, like, in general, anybody who implements this spec should probably also think about what kind of metrics they want to add. For example, how long does it take to run each of the delegates or each of the subnetworks? How long does it take to run each network attachment? That's useful information to know, so that you can kind of time each plugin and figure out, is this one taking 5 seconds, and what's the problem with it? Why is it doing that?
Right.
Kube already has metrics for the entire pod network operation, which would be, in this specification, the aggregate of all of the networks.
Right.
But it's useful for operations people to break that down further, to diagnose things and figure out what's going on in the cluster.
Right. In fact, along those lines, we're digressing here, but it's a fun one. Right. One of the ones that really concerns me is something I don't quite see an easy way to get in regular operations, which is the latency from the point when the user, does something in the API to when the network attachments are fully functional. Right. So not only has the CNI plugin run, but in the cases of stuff like OVS, which have to distribute information throughout the system and get updates done remotely, how long does it take till everything's really done?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's hard to get that information right now.
Yeah. So there might be I think it might be interesting to think about, even if it's not part of regular operations, we might have we do have some regular testing, and that testing framework might take some additional measurements. So we could start to address this kind of questions, I think, in our regular testing.
Yeah, probably should be done.
Anyway, so I wasn't done. So I was just mentioning a couple of things. No, yeah. So regarding APIs, right, I mentioned several things that are talking about new APIs that are done with Kube API resources. And I'm interested in that. It's like a general system building technology. And the API machinery SIG is also too. And they got up and said something about that. In fact, I noticed earlier eBay was going to get up and talk about, the schedule said that eBay was going to talk about the work that they did along those lines. But I never actually saw it, and it's not in the schedule anymore. So I guess it must have been a last-minute scratch for some reason. But I think, building on this kind of technology, the interesting thing is, right, you can the more traditional way to build things is with you cobble together some databases and some message buses, but you can't do an ACID transaction that involves both the database and the message bus. Whereas with Kube API machinery, because of the way the informers work, and the informers, I would say, right? When you do a transaction with the API machinery, there's a reliability story all the way into the controllers. And I think that, and plus the general state orientation, is just a superior way to build systems in general. I also wanted to say something a little bit about FD.io. I missed in Austin the FD.io summit, but I got to it last week. And it seems interesting. It's like something we ought to consider, or maybe it's just a matter they ought to promote themselves better. I think they said they have a CNI plugin that's of generic usefulness and performs much better than, say, OVS. So it seems like something interesting. And they're also working on additional work to more deeply and natively plug into Kubernetes. There are several additional steps that could be taken.
Okay. Thanks for that report, Mike. Anybody else have thoughts from KubeCon?
So I've got one thing. It's a very high-level thing, which is I was impressed at the extent to which Kubernetes and some of the other CNCF projects, particularly Prometheus, have just become dominant now. They've become the standard. Everybody's using them. They've just flattened the opposition. Prometheus was interesting. There were several competing vendors there who were pretty much all saying, and this is how we integrate Prometheus into our pieces now. So that level of dominance is a big change from a couple of years ago. And that's one of the things that seems to be driving the way that Kubernetes is maturing very nicely. I mean, a couple of years ago, it was just nothing like as mature. There were still bugs, there were still edge cases, and it feels like it's very, very rapidly becoming much, much more stable, much more functional, just producing all the stuff that makes it production ready. I know it's production ready already, but you wouldn't have any hesitation putting it into production. Whereas a couple of years ago, it'd be a little bit scary, and a year ago you'd be a little nervous. Now no one would bat an eyelid. And I think from our point of view as a vendor selling to companies who are deploying mostly OpenStack and things like that at the moment, but are looking at Kubernetes as they go forward, I think Kubernetes is just going to take over the world at this rate. And that was obviously one of the themes of KubeCon. Everyone was very happy and excited about that, but it does seem the hype is true as far as I can tell.
So I noticed that nobody who's been talking about KubeCon has said a ton about networking. Is that just because that was not a focus and everybody's more or less happy with the way things are going, or at least satisfied with the state, or it just wasn't really talked about?
Apart from service mesh, I saw, and apart from a couple of things from the likes of Cisco and so on, there was very, very little networking stuff happening as far as I could see. And I think some of that was just which talks were picked. I don't think there's a lack of interest or anything. I think the talks were more on the operational side of service mesh as far as they touched at all on networking. I was a little surprised at that. I expected there'd be more networking related stuff.
There was a session on CNI. I did go to that, but I agree. There was it was not as well in networking was not as well represented in the list of sessions as it is, at least in terms of interest to me.
Maybe that means it's the boring part that people don't actually care about because it just works.
Be nice to think that, yeah.
Right. Okay. Thanks for the trip reports, everybody. Unless anybody else has anything they want to bring up or talk about, I think we're done for today.
Dan, I had a quick
question. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I dialed in a little.
Yeah, no problem.
Dan, so the spec you were talking about, I was trying to find the link on the document. I couldn't yet, if you can put it out in the chat window, that would be wonderful.
Sure. And let's see here. I will also link it from the top of the meeting agenda, just for reference.
Okay. So this is this 040 spec, I assume you're talking about?
No. The spec that I've been talking about is the CRD. Let's see, I will paste it into the chat right now. It's also now on the agenda doc. Two specs we're talking about. The first one is the custom resource definition de facto standard. which is how we propose to implement multiple secondary or sidecar networks within the current Kubernetes infrastructure and framework. So this would be adding additional interfaces into a pod to enable fast data path or secondary networks, storage networks, or more performant networks, or isolation potentially as well. The other spec that you might have been referring to is the CNI specification itself.
Right.
And this specification uses CNI, and so it necessarily refers back to various bits of the CNI specification.
Okay. And so two questions. So both of these from KubeCon, so 040 was mentioned in KubeCon. However, when I go to the spec link, I see the latest is 031 dev. So I was trying to figure out where the 040 might be.
Yep. So, and I assume you're talking about CNI specifically right now.
Yes.
The way CNI works is that we don't actually bump the spec version until we commit code or commit those changes to the spec. So there are a couple of outstanding pull requests that do modify the CNI specification, but those have not been merged yet since they're going through a couple of iterations. So once one of those does get merged that makes material changes to the spec version will get bumped. CNI follows semantic versioning. So it's not like we pile changes into the existing spec and then at one point flip the version. We might do that if the changes that go in are very close together, like if they go in a day after another one, just so that we don't have huge version inflation. But right now that the spec has not actually changed that much since the last version. But again, there are some outstanding PRs that will change it fairly significantly. And one of those is the get PR, which I think is like number 75 or 175, something like that. It should be pretty easy to see in the CNI repo pull request where it is. But that's one of the only changes that I'm thinking of right off the top of my head.
Thank you. And another question is, there was a talk in KubeCon about shaping aspects in CNI. Will that be a part of 040?
Yeah, so the way that works is there was a bandwidth shaping plugin or traffic shaping plugin added to the reference plugin set recently, and that does not specifically depend on a revision of the specification. So there's the CNI specification, and then there's a set of recommendations, or conventions, I should say. And the conventions are things that they're essentially additional bits of data that a runtime can pass to the CNI plugins that get run. And the bandwidth shaping stuff falls under those conventions. So those don't require a bump of the specification. At least we haven't decided that they do at this point in the CNI maintainers meetings. So the traffic shaping plugin is there already. I think it was part of the 0.7 plugins release. So that should be usable now for those setups where it works. It's not obviously it's not going to allow shaping if you use something like Open vSwitch or something else. But if you use fairly standard Linux kernel interfaces for your networking, then it should implement that shaping. The last thing I'll say about that is that the conventions document that talks about some of the things that a runtime could send to a shaping plugin, that's not tied to a specific implementation. So you could write your own shaping plugin that follows those conventions and accepts the same shaping data, like bandwidth data or whatever, from the runtime as the reference plugin. And then you could utilize, you wouldn't have to do any other work. You wouldn't have to get runtimes to conform to that either. You could just kind of replace the shaping plugin with your own if you wanted, and everything would sort of work. So that's some of the background behind that. So yeah, go look at the CNI repo itself, also the plugins repo, and then the conventions document.
Thank you very much.
So yeah, no problem. All right. If one last chance for any additional things people want to talk about. So if not, see everybody either next week for sig-network or in 2 weeks for the plumbing meeting again. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.